Episode 12, August 23rd, 1914. How I Lived Through the First Hours at Mons, by Major A. Corbett Smith. Read by Craig Sinclair. The dawn of Sunday the 23rd broke dim and misty, giving promise of heat. From the late afternoon of the previous day, squadrons and reconnaissance patrols from Ch2's cavalry brigade had been pushing well forward on the flanks in front of the British line. It was pretty though delicate work, this feeling forward to get into touch with enemy outposts and patrols, nor was there a troop which did not have some story to tell that evening of a tussle with enemy cavalry. But as our cavalry pushed farther and farther northwards, they found themselves confronting ever-increasing numbers, and retirement became necessary. Thus were the first shots fired. The morning wore on. The countryside was not unlike one of our own mining districts, the little villages and low-roofed houses giving that curious smoky, grimy effect of mean suburbs of a large industrial town. Here and there great heaps of slag or disused pits and quarries, gaunt iron stems carrying great wheels and heavy machinery. The soldiers were billeted all through the houses or in odd barns and yards. Looking over the garden gate of one little house, I saw the company cooks of one regiment getting the Sunday dinner ready, peeling the potatoes, swinging the pots onto the campfires. From a barn hard by came the sound of singing. A padre had looked in on the rollicking chorus of "Who's Your Lady Friend" swung out into the roadway, and with gentle interruption he improvised a short service, suggesting Rock of Ages as a substitute for the music hall ditty. Down the road a couple of sergeants of the West Ridings leant idly over a gate smoking and watching the folk going off to mass. Into this peaceful scene a motor dispatch rider hurled himself, causing astonishment to a group of West Kents. "Where's the officer? Get moving, you're wanted up there!" And he jerked a thumb over his shoulder. The men rushed for their kit and rifles. Away to the west there was the crack of an 18-pounder. Down the street the cyclist panted. A subaltern burst in on the Sunday dinner of the Bedfords. "Fall in outside at once!" All down the line there sprang the crack of rifles. Beyond the canal outposts of the Lincolns, Royal Scots and others were coming in at the double. A curtain of shell fire was lowered behind them as the British batteries came into action. A curtain fire rolled down before them as the German guns took the range. It was now close upon 1 o'clock, and enemy shells had begun to creep nearer and nearer in from the suburbs upon Mons itself. North of the town, where our lines necessarily bulged out making a salient, the fighting became desperate. Here 3 regiments, especially the Middlesex, Royal Irish and Royal Fusiliers, lost very heavily as they sturdily contested every yard of ground. This point had from the first been recognised as the weakest in our lines. Barely an hour since the first shots were fired, and now by 1 o'clock practically every gun and every rifle of the British force was blazing away as though the powers of hell were let loose. As yet it would seem that the ammunition was being merely wasted for the sake of making a noise. There was no enemy in sight save in the air the circling aeroplanes, and away on the flanks dimly seen clouds of horsemen. A modern battlefield with its curious emptiness has so often been described that here one only need record the fact in passing. There was nothing to be seen. The men were firing in the first flush of excitement at corners of possible concealment, the line of a hedge, the edge of a wood, the very occasional flash of a field gun. On the left, in the Second Corps, the British fire slackened somewhat as the men pulled themselves together. No one had the foggiest notion of what was really happening. It was the officer's business at the moment to steady the ranks and keep them under cover. But away on the right, out towards Binche, where the guards were, the storm had burst out in fullest fury. No slackening there. The German gunfire was incessant and amazingly accurate. The effect of shells from their heavier guns, later so familiar, was at that time overwhelming. Still, the British guns out towards Binche went gallantly pounding on, hopelessly outmatched though they were. The fighting on the right, where General Lomax had the 1st Division, did not slacken for a moment, but steadily became more intense. Now, for the first time, the enemy was really seen, and as his infantry began an advance, the German shell fire redoubled in intensity. Every house where British could be concealed, every possible observation post, every foot of trench, every hill crest, and 400 yards behind it was swept and devastated by the tornado. What communication between units was possible in such a storm? Now battalions and batteries found themselves cut off from their neighbours, each fighting and carrying on by itself. Ch2's cavalry brigade was caught in the thick of it. The guards held on almost by their teeth. The cavalry had to go, and the Munsters and Black Watch lost horribly as they covered the retirement. No finer fighting regiments in the world than these on the right, but nothing human could stay there and live. The little town of Binche was abandoned, the first enemy success. It must have been about 2:30 in the afternoon that this happened, but it was before the fall of Binche that the German infantry attacks began along the line. One end of the York's light infantry trench ended in a little stone-walled pigsty. At least it was a pigsty about church time that morning, but a German gunner thought it would look better without any roof or walls. There was still a fragment 3 feet high on the weather side, and the York CO found it a convenient shelter. For some minutes he had been intently watching through his glasses the corner of a wood about 500 yards in front. He handed the binoculars to the sergeant. "What do you make of it, that corner over by the shed?" The sergeant had a look. He returned the glasses and slowly nodded. "It might be a brigade, sir, from the number of them." "Yes," said the CO. "I thought it was about time. Get word along there that there is to be no firing until the order's given." "Very good, sir." And the sergeant scrambled to his feet, saluted, ducked hastily as a shell seemed to whistle past unnecessarily close, and dived into the rabbit burrow in which his men were squatting. The CO of a British battery in position some distance to the rear had evidently also spotted that particular target, for puffs of bursting shrapnel had begun to appear over the wood and round the edges. Now there was a distinct movement of troops emerging from behind the wood. It was a movement only which could be seen, for the men themselves could scarcely be distinguished against the grey-green countryside. At the very same moment, it seemed as though all the guns in the world had been turned onto those few miles of British front and to the batteries behind. The Yorkshire CO held his fire until the last moment, but when he gave the order for rapid fire, 16 shots a minute per man, it was impossible to miss. You can't help hitting the side of a house, and that was what the target looked like. It was just slaughter. The oncoming ranks simply melted away. The attack still came on, though hundreds, thousands of the grey coats were mown down, as many more crowded forward to refill the ranks. Nearer still, and with a hoarse yell, the Yorkshires, Dorsets, Cornwalls and others were out of the trenches, officers ahead of them, with bayonets fixed and heading straight at the enemy. A murderous machine gun fire met them, but it did not stop them, and in a minute they were thrusting and bashing with rifles, fists, stones, in amongst the enemy ranks. Again the German gunners dropped their range and poured their shells indiscriminately into friend and foe. It was too much for the attacking regiments, and they broke up hopelessly, turned and began to struggle back. It was impossible to attempt any rally of our men. They went on until they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers, or they straggled to the lines as best they could in knots of 2s and 3s, or wandered aimlessly off to the flanks and got lost. Such was one single attack, but no sooner was it broken than fresh regiments would march out to begin it all over again. And here was no pass of Thermopylae where a handful of men could withstand for indefinite time an army. What could the British hope to do against such overwhelming numbers? The cavalry, the only reserves, were working surely as no cavalry has ever worked before. Squadrons were everywhere at once. Wherever a gap was threatened, they were there in support. And wherever they went, there also went the horse gunners, working hand and glove with them. Charge and counter-charge upon the flanks of the attacking infantry, dismounting to cover with their fire a British infantry rally, fierce hand-to-hand encounters with enemy squadrons. Wherever they were wanted, each man and horse was doing the work of 10. But this could not last for long. Now it was becoming only too evident that far from there being a reasonable superiority against us, the British were everywhere along the line hopelessly outnumbered in every arm. At 6 p.m. the enemy had concentrated their fire upon the town of Mons, and it became untenable. Only 6 hours, 6 little hours, since the Belgian townsfolk had come peacefully home from Mass to their Sunday déjeuner, proud and hopeful in the presence of their British allies, and now their houses, their town, a heap of smoking ruins. In those short hours, how many women had seen their children crushed by falling walls or blown to atoms by bursting shells? How many children were left helpless and alone in the world, with no mother or father to take them by the hand and guide them from the hell of destruction. About 2 a.m, the 24th, orders to begin retiring were issued from GHQ. Some 4 hours before, a few of the units, those north of the canal, had begun to fall back, and so the beginning of the move was made. As the last of these crossed the bridges, the detonator fuses were fired and the bridges blown up. For the rest, the men crouched ever in their places, bayonets fixed, rifles always ready, waiting.
Shouting out these pathetic